Now I will turn it on to Mr. Eric Gasho, who is our Senior Vice President at the National Council for Policy and Government Affairs. So, Eric, please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Omar. And very, very excited to moderate this last session of the 2022 Symposium on the Science of Patient Engagement. So today we're really going to pick up on many of the themes that we've heard throughout the day on diversity in clinical trials and digging in specifically around some of the lessons learned that we had from the 2020 Clinical Trials Treatment Act. So I'm very excited to be joined by a rock star panel to close us out. I believe we are waiting for one more speaker to join, but we'll go ahead and get started and hopefully she'll be able to join us shortly. And that's Ricky Fairley, who is the Chief Executive Officer of TOUCH, the Black Breast Cancer Alliance. The triple negative breast cancer survivor, and I love this, survivor/thriver. Ricky's personal purpose, passion, mission, ministry, and blessing is to bring focus, attention, research, science, and action to eradicating Black breast cancer. She co-founded TOUCH to address Black breast cancer as a unique and special disease state with the overall goal of reducing the mortality rate for Black women. Next, we have Dr. Ruben Mesa, who is the Executive Director of the Mays Cancer Center at UT Health San Antonio. He's an international expert who has dedicated his life's work to research and drug development for myeloproliferative neoplasms, or as I will be calling them, and as they are also called, MPNs, a group of chronic leukemias that can cause difficult symptoms, bone marrow problems, acute leukemia, and premature death. Over the past 11 years, Dr. Mesa has led or co-led the development of 6 drugs that have been FDA approved for these chronic leukemias. Dr. Mesa also serves on the board of directors for a National Health Council member, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. Next, we have Dr. Alicia Shelton-Lloyd, who is the Vice President of Medical Affairs at Imago Biosciences, a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company discovering and developing new medicines for the treatment of MPNs and other bone marrow diseases. Dr. Shelton-Lloyd and her team have developed a diversity, equity, and inclusion approach for clinical study access that leverages Imago's core patient engagement strategy, as well as the 6 overarching recommendations from the American Society of Clinical Oncology and Association of Community Cancer Centers Joint DEI statement. While not on her bio, I think I saw earlier during the icebreaker, Alicia and I both share a love of Lake Tahoe. And last but certainly not least, we have Alexis Reisen-Miller, who is the U.S. lead for Merck's Global Regulatory Policy Group. She has advised a range of innovative biopharmaceutical industry players over her 17-plus year career in the industry, helping clients speed development and approval of new therapies. She held similar regulatory roles at Sanofi and Eisai, and also served as a regulatory counsel in FDA's Office of Regulation Policy. So as you can tell, we have a fantastic panel here. We're going to really shape this as a conversation, and with that, would really appreciate if folks can be putting in questions throughout the chat. We'll try to get to them as we're going through some of the questions that we have teed up or afterwards. I know it's late in the day, the last session of the conference, but certainly hope that folks will engage with us as we move forward. So let me just do a quick check. Okay, so it looks like we do have all of our panelists here, which is fantastic. So as I mentioned, we really want to kind of talk at a high level about some of the things we've been hearing about with clinical trial diversity with this great group of experts, and then dig in a little bit more specifically around recent legislation. But I do want to start with maybe some higher level questions just to kind of get a sense of where everyone is coming from and some of the work that they've done around clinical trial diversity. And so my first question, I'm going to have each panelist address this one is, I'd like to hear from you and how you and your organizations have addressed the lack of diversity and representation in clinical trials. So perhaps we can start with Ricky.
Sure. How are you? Thanks for having me today. So I'm from TOUCH, the Black Breast Cancer Alliance, and we are on a mission to get more Black women into clinical trials. You know, the mortality rate for breast cancer for Black women is 41% higher than white women. Our recurrence rate is 39% higher than white women. And we now have this growing body of data that's validating that a Black breast cancer cell looks different from a white breast cancer cell. And if we dug back into history to look at the clinical trials for the drugs we have as standard of care for breast cancer, Cytoxan, adriamycin, all the drugs that we take, and there were no Black women in those clinical trials. And clearly there's some social determinants of health happening in our health system, but there's got to be something wrong with the science for Black women. And until we get more Black women participating and increasing that 3% participation level that we currently have, we're going to keep dying with these crazy numbers. And so we started a movement a few months ago called When We Trial. If you go to whenwetrial.org, and we basically put together an education program for Black women that reflects a lot of research that we did to change the game on how we communicate and educate Black women about trials. Right now, doctors are not inviting Black women to trials, and so we have to advocate for them for ourselves. And a lot of the hesitation is due to the earned medical mistrust that our community feels. But more importantly, it's really just a lack of knowledge, a lack of education, and just fear of the unknown. And we learned pretty quickly in our research that if we can educate, and I can change the mind of a Black breastie in 5 minutes with basic information about what the science is about, how it works, that Advil was in a clinical trial, that you're going to get better care with a very simple message. And so we're trying to do that. And our website is really for Black women, about breasties, by breasties, with breasties. And so we're using pronouns like we and us, as opposed to Dr. Google that's saying you and they, to help Black women feel welcome and understanding, and just break down the information into bite-sized information that they can understand and digest and embody, and then advocate for themselves. So far we've been on the road doing a bunch of events, and we've signed up 4,000 Black women into clinical trial portals across the country. And that sounds like a big number, but it's not. When you look at the 3% participation level, we have to get, do a lot more work to get where we need to be to really make a difference, but at least it's a start. And we know that our formula is working. And so now we're just trying to scale it so that we can educate more Black women and get them into trials.
It's fantastic. Yeah, I would say you're right that 4,000 may not be a large number, but it sounds like a fantastic start. So great work. Really, really happy to hear it. So next, maybe we'll go to Dr. Mesa, if you want to just kind of give a little bit of an introduction of some of the work that you've been doing, particularly as it relates to enrolling marginalized populations into clinical trials.
Great. Well, first, thanks for being here. It's a wonderful topic today, and delighted to be on this great panel that gives a range of perspectives. Inclusive research is critical. It's the central mission of our cancer center. And as I like to share, I think there really are two reasons. One, it's truly about having all of our patients be able to access the benefits of clinical trials. It is a piece that is social justice, meaning, as we look at how we care for complex cancers, whether solid tumors, liquid tumors, rare or common, in most situations, there are areas where we can really improve, or sometimes where we don't have options, where clinical trials really extend the options that we have available. So one, it's important and just. But second, it critically is good science. There are many things that we learn, both regarding the effectiveness of therapies, as well as their potential toxicities that have important tie-in to race, ethnicity, and other pieces. In addition, there are many things of underserved populations as it relates to social determinants of health that can layer in other factors. So we think more broadly as well in terms of rural areas of persistent poverty and others, as nutrition status, comorbidities, delays in care because of rural status. All of these things can be a factor. So at the Mace Cancer Center, we very intentionally have a minority accrual treatment plan for each and every study that we take on. We live in a minority majority community, 69% Latino, and overall, when we factor in all underrepresented groups, the underrepresented groups here are almost 80% of our population. And every trial, there are many components as it relates to the eligibility of a trial, but also really the conduct of a trial. communication around the trial, building trust with different communities to really demystify them. So that includes working with African American churches for diseases that are overrepresented, like multiple myeloma, or males with African American males with prostate cancer, or with Latino communities. That can be a very different sort of connection, but similarly critical. So we really look at it from a 360-degree perspective. Barriers in terms of transportation, number of visits, burden in terms of copays, communicating around the trial, the informed consent process, the patient education materials. We've learned that, again, even the word clinical trial is not a very good translation, in that many of our patients, particularly our Latino patients, frequently will misinterpret that as a legal proceeding as opposed to a clinical study. So even the language around things like that are critical. We've learned that there is usually culturally a family healthcare expert in the families in San Antonio and our region, and whomever that might be a niece, a nephew, a son, a spouse, whoever that is, if that is an individual really is not in the room, it is very difficult to both have a good understanding of the standard of care that's being represented, let alone inclusion in a clinical trial. So it's a key part of our mission, but it has to be very intentional. None of this occurs accidentally, and there's tremendous heterogeneity in terms of sometimes what the needs or barriers need to be, both between groups and patients, and one needs to have some flexibility around each of these.
Great, thank you so much for that. Maybe next we'll go to Alexis.
Great. Thanks. My name is Alexis Raisin-Miller. I want to echo the prior speakers to thank you all for including me on this panel. I think it's just such an important topic. I don't think we have enough time probably in this quick introduction to tell you all the things that Merck is doing and building, but I will tell you that, the company has for a long time now been very committed to the study of a diverse patient population for its products. We have research being conducted in more than 50 countries globally, and we have taken specific steps within the organization to embed diversity and focus on diversity in product development. And that includes the full range of core infrastructure within the company, clinical trial planning, hiring, and also training and assistance at the clinical trial site. So, we have sort of integrated dashboards and tools available at the site level. We have dedicated diversity program leads that were hired and a specific organization within the company to oversee and carry out and help develop diversity plans for new studies, and so on and so forth. So we really do have a multifaceted and also community outreach program. We really do have a multifaceted approach to helping to build diversity into our clinical trials. I think that it's so interesting. I'm in global regulatory policy, so part of what my job is to do is figure out what's going on the outside, attend meetings like this, and also bring people together internally. What's so interesting about embedding clinical trial diversity and embedding diversity into our studies is there are different roles within the company. Everyone has a different opinion and approach and ways to do things, but we all need to work together. It needs to be sort of a holistic, bottom-up, through the system approach. And so I think that despite that sometimes it's hard to tie these threads together, one thing we can all agree on, I can at least speak for Merck, but I'm sure everywhere else, is that everyone agrees we got to figure it out. It's the right thing to do. So we're all really working hard on that, and I'm really glad to be here to speak on behalf of the company.
Great, thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Shilton-Lloyd.
Thanks so much, Eric. As you mentioned, we use the ASCO and ACCC framework to help us plan out our diversity, equity, and inclusion plan for our upcoming phase 3 trial. And it's, got 6 parts, and each part has 6 subparts, and so on and so forth. But I think just thinking about what not only we're doing writ large, but also what I've heard today and yesterday at this conference, there's essentially 3, core guiding principles that we've been using as our guide. And the first is go where these patients are. And, Ricky, I think you and I had a wonderful conversation about what it should look like to be able to provide breast cancer care and clinical trial access in the patients that we would like to serve and that you're serving and supporting, and that gorgeous Victorian house. And, I keep coming back to that idea of how can we go where the patients are? And Dr. Mesa, I've already, you and I have spoken about this at length, but the May Center is doing so much to reach out, particularly to the Latino population, and to make sure that they have access to the trials in your site. In fact, that's been a motivator for you in the trials that you're doing. So if we can go to where the patients are and be there, rather than expecting that through travel and through buses and through hotels, we'll get patients to where we already are comfortable. That's the first barrier that we're overcoming. And so we've been leveraging everything from NMQF's, top 25 African-American serving hospitals to say, if there's not a person in those hospitals that can do a trial for our rare disease, let's at least look for someone in that area that is treating that disease, and let's form a partnership with them. And it might be their first clinical trial, or it might be, a clinical trial that someone else that they've worked with has done. But how can we build up that institution where these patients already are? So let's go where these patients are. The second is, let's communicate in a way that is understandable. So it's data transparency, but it's data transparency beyond just publishing data. It's making sure that we're enabling patients and the caregivers and their clinicians and everyone around them to really fully participate in the shared decision-making process and decide whether or not a clinical study is the right choice for them, and make sure that they have access to the information, because it may not be put in front of them by their primary care physician, right? That was something that came up today too, which is, physicians have unconscious bias, and they may decide never to offer a clinical study participation to certain trials if they don't fit the profile that they think would be a good match. And then the final piece, and that's what we're doing today, is partner. Learn from everyone that you can, figure out what's working, what's already out there that you can build on. This isn't, we're all here together trying to figure out solutions. When Nicholas Brook was speaking earlier, he shared all of these toolkits that PFND and NHC has put together in order to help sponsor companies like mine and Alexis's do this a little easier. Let's leverage that. We're not alone, but in all of this partnership, we have to never lose accountability on our own. So I think that's something that I've noticed just over the past few years, is there's this desire of, there's an organization out there that is doing this, right? There's an organization out there that is overcoming the trust issues with the African-American community. So let's just fund them and walk away, and it's on them. But it has to be a true partnership about providing resources, providing commitment, and never just sort of handing, sort of accountability for access over to an institution, to a clinician, to a patient advocacy group, and walking away, but ongoing partnership and ongoing learning and iterating what we're doing internally.
All right, excellent. Could not agree more. So the next question, I feel like we've already kind of started to answer this to some extent. Maybe we'll kind of dig down a little bit as well. Wondering if each of you can describe in your own words how best to create trials that are inclusive. And, as I mentioned, we've kind of started answering some of these questions, but maybe to kind of dive a little bit more into it, any advice for folks as it relates to either methods that are used, or the importance of really including underrepresented patients and families in the design of studies, and in ways to encourage folks to participate. So maybe we'll kind of reverse this one back around. Hopefully you got a chance to get a sip of water in there, Alicia, and we'll go to you next.
Oh gosh, I think we already have heard so much, some of the ideas on making sure that your site is accessible, making sure that you're thinking about what actual clinical trial participation will look like, and not just from the idealistic of, this is the data we want, so let's bring someone in every 2 weeks to get the data that we want, but thinking about how is this going to fit in with our patient's life. And don't do it on your own. Don't make assumptions, but bring in patients to guide you with how you're doing everything from the trial design through how you're communicating the information. So something that we've done at Imago is that every time we release our data publicly, every time we present data at a conference or publish it, we create a plain language version of that data, and then we iterate it. We don't create it alone. We create it with patient advocacy groups and patients. And then as it gets translated and iterated, we make sure that that's accessible that feeds into our overall clinical trial design as well. What are we hearing? What are the questions about the data that we've already presented that we might want to take into account as we design the next phase of clinical trial? Where are some of the major, sort of sticking points or confusing aspects, and how can we address them when we design the materials to make sure that we're truly getting informed consent, for example? So I think that's one of the practicalities that we've taken in is, again, partner, listen, and be willing to iterate.
Great, thank you. Alexis? Actually, Rick, if you want to go ahead, follow up, that'd be great.
Sure, I'll go next. Thank you for that, Alicia. And I think, it really starts with making a commitment to be intentional about diversity. And from the top down, from the bottom up. And what does that mean? That means that admitting that your baby may be ugly. Albert Einstein, my favorite quote is, "A problem cannot be solved within which the framework it was created." And frankly, nobody is doing a good job right now. Sorry about that, pharma companies. I love you for supporting me, but the baby's pretty ugly right now. And if you look at the recruiting materials, they're not inviting, they're scary, they're intimidating, and the whole process, the whole ecosystem is kind of pushing people away. So we have to change the game on that about everything, and starting with say, okay, hold on, I see that we're not doing it right. I am an alcoholic. What can I do differently, right? So you have to start with that admission, and then you have to approach it for me with deciding that every trial participation is gonna reflect the burden of disease. So if Black women get triple negative breast cancer at 3 times the rate of white women, the numbers in the trial, and I'm not even smart enough to do that math, need to reflect those numbers, not even commensurate with the population, but commensurate with the burden of disease. So you have to really start with a plan to say, I'm going to reach this many Black women as a percentage of my trial, right? Based on the burden of disease. And then think about using cultural humility. And we talk about cultural relevance, but cultural humility. So think about, how is what I'm saying, how are these materials going to reflect, how are they going to make somebody feel? How are they going to make the patient feel? So when a patient sees this material or talks to this doctor or talks to this researcher, how am I going to make them feel comfortable and basically cared for to participate in this trial? And right now, doctors aren't inviting Black women into trials. So how do we change that? And how do we change that game on making people feel comfortable and cared for in that environment? Because that's what's going to make them engage. And that really is going to be best talked about from a patient voice. And so we're finding that a lot of the work that we're doing is having a place on our whenwetrial.org website where patients can see other women who look like them, who have what they have, who have a similar experience, to basically help them understand what this science is all about. So take advantage of that. I think, the people that are doing the trials take advantage of using a patient voice, an advocacy voice, because that's going to be different from the pharma voice or the researcher voice or the whatever. And I think Dr. Mace, I think you used the word earlier, the underserved population, which is kind of the jargon for how we talk about people. I really don't like that word, because that sounds like you're having a dinner party for 10 people, but you only invite 4, right? So what do the other 6 people do? And frankly, the Black people don't even know there's a dinner party. And so I really use the word unsupported. So think about people who are unsupported, who don't know what they don't know, who don't have a clue what they're dealing with, who don't understand the science. And if you approach it from that vantage point, you're going to do a lot better in terms of reaching the numbers that you need.
Great points. Alexis, would you like to weigh in here?
Sure. I mean, I have to agree with you, Ricky. No one is really has addressed this perfectly. I don't think anyone can say that we have, and any of the companies can. So, but what I can tell you is that ours, and I'm sure Alicia's companies, are really looking at this in a new way and have iterated and changed and are sort of exponentially looking at change within their companies with respect to this topic and others, right? So there's silos of information and silos in the way that we work, and there's an old approach and there's a new approach. That's true of CROs, That's true of many components of the healthcare ecosystem at large. But I think that as an industry, we're recognizing and have recognized that we need to work with individuals, patients, and frankly, consumers. We also make vaccines, well, consumers, where they are. So I do agree with Alicia's point about meeting people where they are. The other thing that I think is really important is upskilling and training and making participation in clinical research accessible. So the HR component, we need people who run clinical studies to look like the people we want to be in clinical studies. Because if we, to say that a clinical trial isn't offered to a patient in a certain community, it may be that that clinical trial has not been conducted in that community. That person's doctor wouldn't have heard about it. They wouldn't have had the access to the information. So I couldn't agree with you more that we really need to, we have focused on at Merck, a way to connect through specifically sites that, are better at enrolling patients that have been more difficult for us to reach in the past. We have programs to uptrain and support diversity among our investigators who we can reach out to. We have specific universities that we partnered with. Novartis and other companies have gotten together through, for example, the Beacon of Hope initiative to connect with historically Black medical universities and colleges. And so I think that it really does need to be this multifaceted approach. The comment on language, Ruben, is so interesting that Dr. Mesa made about trials. One thing that we're trying to do, I think someone else also said that in our materials, we need to make them sound less scary. I'm a lawyer, and so I think that part of the reason that a lot of formal commercial corporate jargon sounds scary is because we feel like we need to warn people or tell people about things in a certain serious way. But when that language becomes something that the majority of people don't understand, fail to appreciate, or really frankly just can't get through it, there's something wrong with it, right? Like if we can't finish reading it, there's a problem. So one thing that we have developed within Merck, for example, is a health literacy glossary. And we have it in English, and now it's been rolled out in Spanish internally. And that's a way to sort of align on an understandable, I don't want to say simplified. I don't think, this means that people are dumb and I need to go to like a third grade level. I think it means, can we all understand what this word means? What's a way that we can state it to make it more broadly understandable across different communities and different levels of education and different levels of access to healthcare? And so we have that common glossary that we encourage our, for example, Med Affairs to use and groups developing informed consent forms and information about studies. So that's just like a little bite-sized way. Another way that we have sort of increased outreach to communities and through the partnerships that I mentioned, we're also looking at technology, right? There are digital health tools that can help us access communities that have not been either interested or have not been accessible to research or have not been offered to participate in research in the past. And there's also, we have this one thing that's pretty neat. It's a van that's basically been equipped to be a mobile clinical trial site. So really, I mean, that whole thinking of going to the patients is really critical. But then I think also that inward reflection of how can we build this into our process within the company is really critical. And we have a really strong leader, Adrelia Allen, in our company who's leading this sort of embedding into clinical operations charge of clinical trial diversity. We have that new team of leads. And so we are looking at all new programs with that mindset. It's just better science that someone raised to begin with. It just makes sense.
Mm-hmm. In addition to, quite frankly, just being the right thing to do. Dr. Mesa, would you like to add anything?
So first, I definitely agree with all the comments that have been made. I really think the first step is including patients really at the beginning of the process and not at the end. Because once you have this kind of fully formed protocol beast that has gone through all your internal approvals and everyone has signed off on, and again, you're trying to just kind of distribute that, the opportunity really for meaningful input, is lost. Again, it's true, I think, of any protocol, again, really getting patients' perspective, what it's like to actually navigate that. I have participated or led over 100 clinical trials. And again, with, well-meaning, sponsors of a trial who, again, for the data they require, think it's perfectly reasonable for the patient to come in every other day for 180 days, or have a bone marrow every week because it's interesting science, without really any concept of what this actually means for patients. I've had companies well-meaning, again, who want to include inclusive research, forward us the inclusion criteria, say, oh, what would you do different? And it's 10 pages of single space inclusion and exclusion criteria. And I'm like, what human being is going to navigate this gauntlet of inclusion and exclusion criteria, let alone someone who's a real person, who, again, if they're in South Texas, they're likely to have higher liver function tests. Their renal function is likely to be off. The social determinants of health increase tremendous numbers of prediabetes and comorbidities and other things that don't match with almost the utopian person being sought for some of these clinical trials. So I think it really needs to begin really at the beginning, and I think it needs to be almost a slightly different paradigm. If it's window dressing, it doesn't really work. It really starts at the trial design. What does a trial really need? Do you really need somebody to have perfect liver function tests? The drug is renally excreted. It's just boilerplate upon boilerplate upon boilerplate nonsense that gets padded onto these studies that frankly has made clinical research difficult, but in individuals, again, with a range of challenges, and I definitely agree with Ricky's comment, underserved is probably not the right term, because again, there is both a range of barriers that people can experience. Part of that clearly includes the barriers that individuals that are African American, Latino, and others may face, but it certainly intersects with other barriers people can find in terms of areas of persistent poverty, rural travel, and other things. One of the things we've learned here in South Texas as well is try to learn from each other. So I work very closely with colleagues at other centers that may have challenges, but they are different. So my good friend Rob Wynn from the director at Virginia Commonwealth, or Ray Du Bois at Medical University of South Carolina, some of the barriers that African American patients face can be very different than ones in Latinos. And we try to learn, compare, and contrast. Latinos are not a homogeneous group, nor are African Americans by any means, in terms of a whole range of reasons. And again, how does one really try to tailor some of these things to meet? Even in a trial, some of the solutions that may work in some areas may not be right for others. Again, what may work for even certain populations at USC, might be very different than what's a good option for really trying to have a trial succeed at Medical University of South Carolina. So all of these things are important, but I think they definitely begin really with the input kind of on the front end. If you've got a fully baked trial and protocol that was written in somewhat of an academic vacuum, then it's going to be a much, much harder time.
Great. Yeah, I would say that while some people may see weekly bone marrow draws as interesting science, others may consider that cruel and unusual punishment. So really important to really thinking about that from the perspective of the patient. So we did mention sort of at the top here, and it's in the title of the session as well. We do want to talk a little bit about the Clinical Trials Treatment Act of 2020. Sort of knowing that many underrepresented, or as Ricky so astutely put it, under or unsupported people are served by the Medicaid program. I want to look at sort of what the impact has been in a pretty short amount of time. So I'm going to start with Alexis. And I guess the first question that I'm sure many on the screen are wondering is, what is the Clinical Trials Treatment Act? And what problems has it attempted to address, and sort of what has the impact been so far?
Yeah, so I mean, this is what is the Clinical Trial Treatments Act is not a complex question. What I was going to say is, it's important to think about clinical research as a component and function of a broader healthcare system. And part of that healthcare system includes our everyday care, who we go to, the specialists that we go to, how we receive access, and what we have access to, right? And that includes, and that triggers actually questions about who pays for things, right? In the US, it's not like it is in some other countries, a single payer system. There's a huge range of access and availability of medicines and treatments. And likewise, there's a huge range of access and availability to clinical trials. So if you picture this as like a one tiny slice of it, we in Merck, and I know other companies have the same issue, sometimes there are financial barriers to participation that are very difficult for us to overcome and help patients with. So there are legal prohibitions from us. There are legal reasons why we can't, for example, help certain sites or certain individuals make sure that something is affordable to them. There's restrictions on what we can do there. So one example is the standard of care is not covered. And it's horrible to think about this, but the standard of care therapy is not covered in all cases by all insurance or by Medicare and Medicaid, depending on what treatment it is, right? And so if you want a patient to participate in the study, but they will be charged out of pocket for an aspect of the study that's not investigational, that would be the standard of care, or even if insurance pays for some of it, but their out-of-pocket costs are still exorbitant, they will not participate in the study, right? And so that's something that's really challenging, that's hard for us to work around. So in my job, I'm an advocate, I'm not a lobbyist. I talk with FDA, so it's more on the side of approval. But I do know that my colleagues, and particularly ASCO lobbyists and, other groups have supported the Clinical Treatment Act. And the purpose of that is to require state Medicaid programs to cover and reimburse for routine costs of care for a Medicaid enrollee who is participating in a qualifying clinical trial. So that requires the Medicaid programs of each state to submit a plan to CMS to say, this is how we intend to provide this coverage. So basically what it does is it opens up accessibility and the possibility of participating in clinical research to more people. So it's a really concrete example of, we have we would like to get to Z, but before we get there, we have X and Y problems. How can we build something to help address it? Sometimes we can do it ourselves and we can restructure how we design our studies. But sometimes we really need changes in the law and the legal framework, or maybe even the community-based framework for accessibility to medical care to be able to get there. So this is a good example of how an advocacy-driven cause resulted in a law that will increase accessibility of Medicaid patients to clinical trials. So will they be able to have certain things covered? Yes, that's, not all, it's only 41 states as of this summer have sent in that plan, but state plan amendment rather, but that's a really concrete example that I can give you of something we can do to try and make things better. That's not, something we would not have been able to fix, for example, as a sponsor on our own.
I think if I could just add something to that, I think that's an excellent encapsulation of it, Alexis. But it also points out another, right, we're reducing one of the barriers, but it shows us another barrier, which is not all institutions will even accept Medicaid patients. And so some of the institutions that we typically go to from the sponsor side to the industry side, because they just, they're clinical trial powerhouses, they just turn it out, they know how to do it. They don't even see the patients that we're trying to now reach with this new act. And so I think we've reduced or lowered one barrier, and maybe only in 41 states. And so that's a whole nother conversation we could get into, but it's made us really aware of just our decision-making process as industry, as sponsors, in what we're asking of the clinical research organizations or our internal clinical operations arms, with where they always go for the same patients, and how that is a barrier that, to be honest, I didn't even realize until I began to dig into this. And so I think that's something to keep in mind too, is there is always another hill to climb. But what I love is that when we get together, we can sort of shorten some of the hills and keep climbing.
Yeah, can I just respond to that really quickly? I mean, the other thing that you're pointing out that is obviously true, we go to certain sites, we can expand what sites we go to, but the sites also need to partner with us, and that means being aware that this has changed, and they may be able to reach out to people who previously they might not have. And so that requires a different level of partnership and awareness and education, not for our participants necessarily, but for the people who are recruiting them and who can ask them to stay in a study or explain to them why their participation is important to the community.
I think it's an impactful act, although without question it is a partial fix, but it definitely helps. So I'll use a concrete example. Before this act, Well, when I led efforts in Arizona for my prior institution, we had a trial again in breast cancer with Maricopa County. Again, that was open in Maricopa County, but the barrier was not the experimental drug. It was really the standard of care drug that, ironically, the fancy new drugs we could typically get, but it was the adriamycin that was in the control arm that, again, even the small copay around that piece was a real barrier for the patients, or other expenses, again, that were, quote, standard of care. So I think, from a policy standpoint, it was very important. In fact, need to look at more things like this, because, why would you not cover the standard of care for these patients getting on a clinical trial? It is by definition the standard of care. Why would it not be covered? So things like this, I think, are really positive, but of course, their benefit again is limited. And you're definitely right, Alicia. Sadly, and I won't call out colleagues, but a significant number of the largest academic centers that are the, quote, powerhouses specifically try to exclude patients based on payer mix because they are underwater financially for their care, and really put up barriers. It's something that at the Mace Cancer Center we're incredibly proud to be able to care for all in society. It's part of my job as also being the financial leader to say, okay, well, how do we try to get it done? It's not always easy, but it's a critical part of our mission, and one that is incredibly rewarding for us to really try to be able to treat everyone who walks through the door in the way that they should be treated.
Let me back it up a second, maybe. I have a question in the chat. When we talk about covering or not covering standard of care, what exactly is it that we mean and what we're trying to address?
So I can start and then others can add on. When you conduct a study in a new product, a new therapy, you're comparing it to something else. And very frequently, the comparator is the standard of care. So if you were to undergo treatment for XYZ condition, this is what you normally would receive. And the study will be divided up into two arms, for example. And one arm will show you standard of care results, and then the other arm will show you the investigative results. And so in order to be able to include patients, the protocol will say, for example, dose patient with the standard of care by the 3rd day. If we can't get the insurance to cover the standard of care and or at least authorize it within that amount of time, it causes problems in the protocol. If they never authorize it, or if they say we would rather do something else, we can't have that patient continue in the study. We can't, likewise, if they say we will provide coverage for the standard of care, but only 80%, we are, based on what our legal and compliance views in the company are, unable to pay for that additional 20%. So if there's not, because some of these therapies are very costly. So if there's not a way for patients to be able to have that standard of care covered, it can make it difficult for them to participate. So that's just one example. So this act, which I agree is limited, at least shines a light on some of the financial burdens that we face in just being able to ensure that participation is broad, or at least the opportunity for that. And I think for me, what's really interesting is when I'm explaining this to my colleagues outside of the US, it blows their mind, completely blows their mind. How is this not something that's always covered for patients? How is it possible that it would only be 80%? How is it possible that patients in government programs wouldn't have access to the standard of care? How is it possible that there would be a delay in authorizing it? Or how is it possible, for example, that they would only cover a certain portion, or that they would ask us to use something other than what the treatment guidelines say or the standard of care? And I don't have any answers. I don't have any answers to those questions. As I mentioned, it's this larger part of the ecosystem. But just having advocacy pushes like this highlights how complex that system is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, thanks for that explanation. I think that was really helpful, and probably something I should have asked before we dove into it to really start to frame up the problem that we're trying to solve for. So a couple more questions. I know we're starting to get some in the chat. And again, I'll just remind folks, if you do have any questions, please utilize the Q&A function. We'll try to get as many as we can. So kind of looking back over the past few years or so, and looking at the impact of the pandemic, and probably just sort of the broader societal issues that we've seen, would you say that unequal access to clinical trials has been an issue that has been affected by the pandemic, either worsened or, hopefully in some respects has improved over the last few years as well? But I'd be curious to know sort of how we maybe have seen an impact of that based on the pandemic. So I don't know, I'll just open it up and see if anyone wants to jump in.
I would say there's been some both positives and negatives. So on the positive side, I think the advent of really rolling out where telemedicine fits in, I think patients get greater awareness, even with barriers to being able to access the healthcare system in a range of ways is a plus. It's helped with screening, it's helped with interval toxicity checks. It's led to a variety of creative solutions that have really expanded. It's increased other things indirectly, potentially remote monitoring of sites, conducting clinical trials that again may allow for greater flexibility in terms of sites and decentralized clinical trials and other things. So I think all of those things certainly as, as a positive. On the negative, again, I think there have been, an increase in somewhat of a mixed view of science and trust issues that have arisen because of, misinformation regarding vaccine trials and others, and not to be ignored when all those things kind of get lumped together. Can I really trust these things? I want to do my own science. A 40,000 person phase 3 study, I choose not to really honor that, but somebody tells me to take ivermectin, I'll do it. So there's that. I think it really has been a negative, as we really try to promote clinical trials overall. But some of the logistical things definitely help, as well as I think both in the conduct, but also I think from the sponsor side, from my end, that, maybe you can, let the reins be a little bit looser, and from the FDA regulatory side, and it not be a catastrophe.
I'd love to hear from Ricky from the patient's perspective. I mean, what have you been hearing from your 4,000 strong individuals?
I don't really have any hard data to share on this point, but I would think that the numbers have gone down because I know, we just know from mammography numbers and going to the doctor numbers, they all suck. I mean, I think the latest number I heard for 28% of Black women did not get a mammogram during COVID. I think that number's low. I think that's sort of self-reported data. Nobody wants to admit that they didn't go get their mammogram, but I think a lot of people did not go to the doctor or the hospital out of fear. And so I would, just kind of speculate that also happened with trials. However, we do have some new drugs on the horizon for breast cancer that just got approved by the FDA. Keytruda and HER2 are some really good drugs. And so I think that women that were sick and maybe were getting treatment already may have been participating in trials if they were participating before COVID started, that they continued that work. But then I have some stories too. They're all kind of anecdotal about breasties who were in trials and guess what, got COVID, and that interrupted their participation. So I think a lot of factors are in play here, but it's still not enough people in trials. You know what I mean? I think that, I do think COVID may have had a negative effect. So.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the things that we're all feeling is how, it was such a shock to the healthcare system, and it backed up standard care. And so now that we're able to all go back in and get our screening care and get our standard care, it's, and clinical trials are starting back up again. I know that the burden on just the healthcare workers, and I'm sure Dr. Mesa, this is something you and your team feel, intimately, that the burden on the healthcare workers just to provide healthcare on all those individuals who had to defer care for, 2 years or so, plus then get them into clinical trials. There's this tranche of people that maybe should have started treatment on the standard of care therapy 2 years ago, and now we would know that, okay, they're ready that they're the right candidate for a clinical study, because the standard of care therapy isn't working for them or is working suboptimally. They haven't had those 2 years on that standard of care therapy because they weren't diagnosed, because they didn't go in for screening. And so there's this huge, just bolus of need that's impacting the healthcare system. And I know as an industry partner and a sponsor, we're trying to figure out, how do we support our patients? How do we support our sites? How do we hear from the patients that were diagnosed but just had to defer care, and their questions with, what does this mean for my long-term, my long-term health, and what I should think about in participation? It is something that I think we're all trying to navigate right now.
And that's actually a great segue into a question that we do have coming through the chat, specifically directed to Dr. Mesa. With all of the environment that Alicia just laid out for us, and how the healthcare system is so underwater at the time, how do we incentivize providers to refer their patients to clinical trials in ways that we haven't done in the past?
It is very challenging, without question. I mean, I think the other important aspects where the pandemic has been a big challenge for clinical research, and certainly it does not help in this regard to any degree, has been the impact really on the workforce, not only in terms of burnout, as was alluded to, but truly, nursing staffing shortages that, many institutions have really struggled with, the tremendous workforce dynamics with the, vacuum of traveling nurses and other pieces was huge. And again, even brought a lot of people that were research nurses to go back to be traveling nurses because of tremendous economic incentives for doing so. The recruitment and retention of really all of the staff involved with clinical trials has been a tremendous challenge. There's been almost an exponential increase in the number of these individuals needed, with CROs and pharmaceutical sponsors and academic centers, and it's been very, very difficult. I'm one of the board members for the American Association of Cancer Institutes, and again, we estimate between 40 and 200% turnover that certain cancer center clinical trial offices have had over the last 18 months. So that's that's a huge impediment, without question. So all things really to try to navigate through. Now, incentivizing providers is very challenging, because it's always a delicate balance, both with anti-kickback laws as it relates to referring physician rules and experiences, as well as even kind of internally, so clinical trials are not so incentivized that again, people are putting inappropriate patients on the cancer clinical trials. So it really is a tricky thing. It really is around mission. I will say, with all of those things involved, I think that the main thing that incentivizes folks is to make it as simple as possible. So I think that both my colleagues within our institution, but the colleagues we really work with in our community, people are in medicine because they want to make a difference for patients. And I think they feel if there's a clinical trial that patients will benefit from, overall, patients will be referred. But if you make it such a hassle, then they're less likely to go through all of the hoops. So I think things that really make it easy to refer a patient to participate in a clinical trial, transparency when they're on the clinical trial in terms of how their patient is doing, and certainly for the registering physician, making it as easy for them as possible, are really some of the most critical pieces. So things that really can make it less of a burden are key. And some of that is involved again on how difficult is the protocol and other things, taking in mind both the burden for the patient, but also for the physicians.
Ricky?
Can I build on that?
Please.
Our data shows that doctors are not inviting Black women into trials. And so our approach has been, I can't really change how a doctor interacts with patients, but what I can change is to educate our patients. And so a lot of our initiative with When We Trial is to teaching patients how to advocate for themselves and ask for the trials, because I don't think we can count on the doctors to offer them. I would love for every doctor to be like Dr. Mesa and offer trials, for you guys to really offer trials, but that's not happening. And our data shows not only that they're not being invited to trials, but when they initiate the conversation about trials with their doctor, they still walk away from that conversation not feeling equipped with all the information they need to make a decision. And they go home and talk to their families, and their families are, you're gonna get the sugar pill and die. Don't do that. And so they don't have the wherewithal and the information to kind of explain their situation to their families, and so they don't do it. So we really spend a lot of time and energy on saying, okay, here's how you talk to your doctor, here's what you ask for, demand kind of that golden rule standard of care, which, treat others like you want to be treated, and ask for the trial, because we're not getting that support in our community.
Great advice. So I think we have time for maybe one final question that's come in. We just talked about some of the reducing burden for physicians to refer patients. We've talked about a little bit about reducing burden for patients and for participants, but what about focusing on the burden of caregivers and family members as it relates to clinical trial participation? Any advice there?
I think you raise a critical piece, Eric. We have a nurse leader at our institution who focuses for the Cancer Center on caregiver research. And you're right. Being a caregiver is very difficult. I watched my wife be a caregiver for her elderly parents on a range of healthcare issues, not cancer, fortunately, but it's incredibly difficult because, of course, caregivers themselves have work, have responsibilities. Maybe you're taking care of kids, are working, other sorts of things, and there's a myriad of barriers. And again, the assumption that they can drop everything to do things is sometimes a huge barrier. For us, and with challenges with social determinants of health, it can be huge. In South Texas, we have a tremendous overrepresentation of hourly workers and other things where, even if their workplace will allow them to be off for having caregiver issues, they're not going to pay them, and this is income that they desperately need, for basic expenses in terms of living. So these can really be critical things. Again, I think things to be mindful of what's really being asked. And I think as we decentralize trials a little bit more, and there's more kind of home activities or other things or injections or other sorts of things, you need to really be mindful of a range of these things. The barrier on the caregivers really is something to be very mindful of.
Right. And Alicia?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that's where we've benefited from the partnership that we have with various patient advocacy groups who have helped us not only make sure that we're hearing from the patient voice, but have specifically reached out and, brought in the caregiver voice, and specifically reached out and brought in the caregiver voice in different parts, in different geographies within the U.S. and different, areas, and helped us think about and hear directly from those caregivers. And that's something that I don't think I can sort of emphasize enough, which is, start early, to your point earlier, Dr. Mesa, which is, don't do this at the very end after the protocol is set and there's 10 pages of inclusion and exclusion. Start to think about, oh, wait, we need someone to take a bus to our center 3 times a week or be driven by someone. Start at the very beginning and bring in not just the patients, but their caregivers. And for us, the best partners to find that have been the patient advocacy groups.
Yeah, I can just add on to that we have similar programs where, for example, we have a patient advisory board. We have other opportunities to look at protocols. And just for example, I remember being at a prior company where there was a study for it was on children, and they thought, let's reduce the length of visits, hospital visits for assessments, because they're small, they're infants, and that would be, it'd be too difficult for them to stay all day. But then, you know, the response and input we got from actual patients who were actually not patients, the caregivers, obviously, in that instance, they said, listen, I have other kids. I can't go to this hospital 3 times, 4 times, 5 times in 1 week. Give me 1 day, help me find childcare. So, and for the other kid. And so you do get significant feedback from engaging patients early and often, as was mentioned earlier. I think that, I mean, most companies, including ours, and I'm sure Alicia's also, does cover some aspects of like transportation, childcare, food, just sort of basic things like that. We do offer that. And there are some restrictions and limitations, or at least they're perceived on sort of limits to what we can do for that. Does it look too flashy? Is it for too long? Did they not really need that much, you know? And so it's this push and pull where we really try to do that. But I think the best way really is to get that input up front to help try and make sure the protocol is fit for purpose and the assessments we're doing are being done in the least disruptive way possible, while maintaining that integrity that we need for, you know, to not have wasted the patient's time.
And Ricky, would love to have you have the final word.
When the patient's sick, everybody's sick, the whole family. So everybody's a caregiver in the family if they have it. One crazy statistic, 77.3% of Black moms are single moms. So when they're the patient or the caregiver, everybody's involved, and they got to get childcare. So I think you have to really think about, it's a family affair. The whole family's sick. So, you know, everybody's a caregiver and has to be involved in the whatever needs to be done.
Hear, hear. Okay, well, look at that. It is exactly 4:30. So great job, everybody. Really enjoyed the conversation. And I know you gave a lot of the attendees a lot of food for thought that I'm sure will really spark a lot of conversation within their organizations, and importantly within the walls of the National Health Council as well. So I hope everybody is virtually joining me and giving them a round of applause, and look forward to continuing the conversation.